The house felt too quiet. Ever since her father passed away, the music had vanished from the walls. The living room, once filled with warm melodies, now sat cold and still. The piano, his pride and joy, stood untouched near the window. Its glossy surface had gathered a thin layer of dust. No one had opened the lid in weeks. She stared at it every morning before, leaving for school, and every night before going to bed. But she never got too close. The piano used to be alive because of him. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. But to her, he was everything. Her father was the kind of man who could make anyone stop and listen. When he played, even the birds outside the window would seem to pause. He believed music could heal anything: sadness, fear, even silence. Now, all that was left was the silence. She was only 14, but her heart felt older than her age. People told her it would get easier, time would heal. But no one really knew how hard it was to walk past that piano every single day. Her mother had tried her best to hold things together. She worked long hours, came home tired, cooked dinner, and kept the home running. But even she didn't touch the piano. It was like they had both made an unspoken agreement. Don't touch it, don't mention it. But something in her chest wouldn't let it go. She remembered the last night he played. It had been raining outside. The lights were low. He had played a soft tune, his favorite song. She had curled up on the couch, listening with half-closed eyes. He smiled at her, nodding gently to the rhythm, his fingers dancing over the keys like they belonged there. That was the last song he ever played, the last smile she ever saw. Now she stood in front of the piano again. Her hand reached out slowly. She hadn't planned to touch it, but her fingers moved on their own. The cool surface of the wooden lid sent a shiver up her spine. With a quiet breath, she lifted it open. Dust swirled in the air. The keys looked exactly the same, white and black, simple and still. She sat down gently on the bench, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She wasn't even sure she remembered how to play. She placed one finger on the middle C, pressed it. A single note echoed in the quiet room. It wasn't perfect, wasn't strong, but it was alive. She pressed another note, then another. Her hands trembled, but they didn't stop. She played the first 4 notes of the song, the one he always played, the one that made her feel safe. It's the one that belonged to him. She stopped after the 5th note and sat still. A tear rolled down her cheek. The piano made a sound, and it was like hearing his voice again, even if just for a second. That night, she didn't tell anyone. She closed the lid again, wiped away her tears, and went to bed. But something had changed inside her. The next night, she returned to the piano. This time, she brought her father's old notebook. It was filled with handwritten sheet music and little notes he had scribbled in the corners. She turned to the page with the title, River of Dreams. The song he loved most. She placed it carefully on the stand. Her hands still shook, but less than before. She began again. 1 note, 2. Then a soft melody. She made mistakes. She stopped often, but she kept going. And somewhere between the wrong notes and the broken rhythm, the music began to return. Not perfect, not polished, but real. It wasn't about sounding like her father. It was about remembering him, for the first time in weeks. She smiled, and far outside the window, a neighbor walking home slowed his steps and looked up at the house. He thought he heard a familiar tune, a song he hadn't heard since the man. With the kind hands and warm smile used to play it every evening, the music was back, and though no one knew it yet, this was only the beginning. Late at night, when the lights were out and the town was quiet, she crept into the living room like a whisper. Everyone believed the piano was still silent, but they didn't know. Each night, she waited for her mother to fall asleep. She would peek into her mother's room, making sure the breathing was deep and steady. Then, barefoot and silent, she would tiptoe to the piano and lift the lid with slow, careful hands. The keys greeted her like old friends she was still learning to trust again. She didn't turn on the lights. She liked the darkness. It made her feel closer to her father, like he was just on the other side of the music, listening quietly. She opened his old notebook. The pages were worn, some corners folded, some smudged with faded fingerprints. His handwriting was still there. The top of the page, just above the first note of the melody, he had written, "For when you feel lost, let this guide you back." Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then she began to play. Soft, slow, uncertain. The melody didn't sound beautiful at first. It was filled with pauses, stumbles, and forgotten notes. But every time she got stuck, she looked at his words and tried again. She didn't know that outside, across the narrow street, old Mr. Haniff was sitting on his porch. He lived alone and couldn't sleep well these days. Every now and then he thought he heard music drifting through the night air. He listened carefully, trying to catch the melody. Was it her? He wasn't sure, but he closed his eyes and smiled anyway. Back inside the house, she continued playing. Some nights she cried, her tears falling onto the keys as her fingers moved. Some nights she smiled, remembering how her father used to nod along and say, "Play from your heart, not your hands." Her heart was tired, but it still remembered how to feel. No one knew what she was doing. At school, she stayed quiet. Her friends thought she was just grieving. They didn't ask many questions. They didn't know she was slowly stitching her heart back together with music. Even her mother didn't notice. She was always exhausted from work. Sometimes she would hear a soft sound in her dreams like a lullaby from long ago, but she never woke up enough to understand what it was. One evening, she made a mistake. She played a little too loud. The final note echoed longer than she meant. From her mother's room, a door creaked. She jumped up, quickly closed the notebook, and rushed to her bedroom, heart racing. She lay in bed pretending to sleep. The sound of her own heart beat loud in her ears. The next morning, her mother said nothing. Maybe she hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had chosen to say nothing at all. Still, the girl was more careful after that. She played with softer fingers, like a feather brushing against the keys. She even began using the pedal more, not to sound grand, but to keep the notes floating, gentle and calm. Day by day, night by night, something was changing in her. She wasn't just learning to play again. She was becoming stronger, braver. The sadness was still there, but now it had music to hold it. One night, as she played, she reached a part of the song she had never been able to finish before. The final few bars had always felt too heavy, too painful, but this time, she didn't stop. Her hands moved forward, unsure but determined. The notes came one after another. She hit a wrong key, flinched, but didn't quit. She corrected herself and kept going. And when the final note rang out into the stillness, she let it echo until it disappeared into the dark. She sat still for a long moment. Then, for the first time since her father's passing, she whispered aloud, "I did it." And somewhere deep inside, it felt like he was whispering back, "I knew you would." The notice board outside the community center had a bright red poster. Annual Town Music Night this Saturday. One final performer slot left. Sign up at the front desk. She stood in front of it, her school bag still slung over one shoulder. Her eyes stared at the words, but her hands stayed frozen at her sides. It felt like the paper was glowing, calling to her. This festival had always been her father's favorite event. Every year, he'd sign up, polish his old shoes, iron his shirt, and walk onto that small stage like it was a grand concert hall. He never cared about applause. He played for the love of it and the joy of sharing music. She remembered how the whole town used to clap for him. Not because he was the best, but because he made them feel something. Now, there was one spot left, and nobody had filled it. Her heart beat faster. Her fingers twitched like they were already on the piano. The song she had been secretly practicing his song it was almost ready. Not perfect, but honest. Still a voice inside whispered, "You're just a girl. You've never played alone before. You'll mess up. Everyone will be watching." She stepped back, but then another thought came, soft but clear. He would have wanted the song to be heard. Evening, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her fingers kept moving like they were dancing on invisible keys. Over and over, she heard the melody in her mind. By morning, the decision was made. She walked straight to the community center, heart pounding like a drum. The receptionist was kind, but distracted, flipping through a folder of papers. "I want to sign up," she said quietly. The woman looked up. "Name." Her voice trembled. "Just write A.H." The woman raised an eyebrow. "No full name." "It's for someone," she said, blinking fast. "Just those letters, please." The woman shrugged, wrote it down, and added her to the list, and just like that, she was in. The next few days passed like a dream and a nightmare. She practiced every single night now. No more stopping halfway. No more running away from mistakes. She played from beginning to end, again and again. The music was getting smoother, clearer. Her hands no longer shook when she reached the final notes. Still, her mind was full of questions. What if I forget a note? What if they laugh? What if no one understands why I'm doing this? But every time fear came close, she sat down and played again. The piano had become her hiding place, at her strength. At school, her friends noticed she looked different. Quieter, focused. She smiled less. But there was something strong in her eyes, like she was carrying a secret that meant everything. One day her best friend asked, "Are you okay?" She nodded. "Just working on something." She didn't tell anyone what it was, not even her mother. She wanted it to be a surprise, not just for the town, but for herself. The night before the festival, she sat at the piano longer than ever. She turned the pages of her father's old notebook one last time. Her eyes stopped at the bottom corner of the song sheet. There was a tiny line written there in his familiar handwriting. "Music is how the heart speaks when words can't." She smiled softly. "Then I'll let mine speak," she whispered. She closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and played the song from start to finish with no pause, no tears. No fear, just love. The morning of the festival arrived like any other. The sun rose softly over the quiet town. Kids played outside. Shopkeepers opened their stores. And no one knew what she was about to do. Not even her mother. She had kept it a secret from everyone, every classmate, every neighbor, even the aunties who always asked too many questions. It wasn't because she didn't want to share. It was because she wanted this moment to be hers. Something between her, her father. She sat at the breakfast table pretending everything was normal. Her mother poured tea and reminded her to finish her homework later. She nodded, smiled, and quietly slipped her father's notebook into her bag. Inside the notebook was the sheet music, the one with the tiny message at the bottom. Music is how the heart speaks when words can't. She held that notebook like it was part of her heartbeat. At school, she barely said a word. During lunch, her friends chatted and laughed. She picked at her food and kept checking the clock. Her hands were cold. Her stomach was in knots. But she didn't run. The sign-up list still said A.H. Nobody had figured it out. The community hall buzzed with excitement that evening. Chairs were lined up. Fairy lights were hung around the small stage. Simple wooden piano sat in the center, polished and ready. It looked just like the one in her living room. One by one, the townspeople arrived. Grandparents, teachers, children, everyone took their seats with smiles and folded programs. The yearly music night was a big deal here, brought everyone together. Backstage, she sat alone. She had arrived early, tucked her bag under the bench, and kept her head down. Her fingers moved over imaginary keys in her lap. The melody played over and over in her head. Her name wasn't on the program. It's just a H final performance. Nobody expected what was coming. As the event began, performers stepped onto the stage, guitar players, singers, even a small band. Each act brought smiles, laughter, polite claps. But no one moved like they did in the old days. When he used to play, backstage, she peeked out from behind the curtain. She saw familiar faces. Her teacher, the baker, her neighbor, even Mr. Haniff from across the street, sitting in the front row. Then she saw her mother. She sat near the back, alone, flipping through the program. She didn't look excited, just tired. Probably thinking about how her husband used to sit here, always the final act. And tonight, she had no idea who A.H. even was. The host stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you to all our wonderful performers tonight. Now our final act of the evening. A special entry signed simply as a H. The audience turned their heads, whispering. The girl took a breath so deep it hurt. She stood up slowly. Her heart thumped so loudly, it felt like everyone could hear it. She stepped out from the curtain. Gasps filled the hall. A few people leaned forward. Was that really her? She walked slowly to the piano. Legs felt heavy. Her palms were damp. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but not for long. She didn't want to lose her focus. She opened her notebook. The pages looked brighter under the stage lights. Then she sat. She didn't bow, didn't smile. She just closed her eyes and placed her hands on the keys. She waited for the noise to fade, the whispers to stop, and when the room was completely silent, she began. The first note rang out like a whisper in the dark. It was soft, careful, almost too quiet, but it was enough. The room, filled with over 100 people, fell into a silence so still you could hear the flicker of the fairy lights. Every eye turned to the girl sitting on the wooden piano bench. Some recognized her immediately. Others squinted, trying to place the face, but no one spoke. Not even her mother. She sat frozen in the back row, clutching the program in her lap, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. That was her daughter, and she was playing a song. Up on stage, the girl's fingers trembled. Her heart beat so fast, she could barely breathe. For a second, she felt like she might faint. The lights were warm on her face. Her legs shook under the bench. Her hands hovered just above the keys. She wasn't sure if she could keep going. She had practiced this moment so many times, but now that it was real, everything inside her felt too heavy. Then her eyes caught something in the front row. Old Mr. Hannaford leaned forward, eyes closed, swaying ever so slightly with the rhythm, just like he used to when her father played. The girl swallowed hard and played the next note, then the next. With each sound, her fear melted slowly, painfully, but it melted. The melody began to take shape. Same one that used to float through their home at sunset. It's the same one that made neighbors pause on the sidewalk. The same one her father always ended with a soft smile and a wink. Her fingers danced across the keys. Not perfectly, not professionally, but honestly, she didn't rush. She let the music breathe, let each note rise and fall like waves in a quiet. See? She hit one wrong key in the middle, but didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She just corrected it and kept going. Because the song wasn't about being perfect. It was about remembering and honoring and healing. She thought of the nights. She played alone in the dark, her tears mixing with the notes. She thought of how broken she had felt, how lost. Now, she didn't feel lost. Now, she was telling the town something without saying a single word in the crowd. People leaned forward. A shopkeeper who had once taken piano lessons from her father held her breath. A young boy stopped chewing his candy. A mother pulled her child into her lap, suddenly afraid to make even the smallest sound. Her mother stared, stunned, her chest tight, her eyes full. She had not heard that melody since the funeral. She had thought it was too painful to ever hear again, but now it didn't feel painful. It felt like home. As the girl reached the final part of the song, the slow, rising finish that her father always called the goodbye, she blinked away a tear, not out of sadness, out of peace. She held the final note a little longer, her foot pressing gently on the pedal, letting the sound ring out into the air. And then she lifted her hands. Silence. No one moved. No one clapped, not for the first few seconds. It was like time had stopped then. A single clap from the back row. Her mother, then another, Mr. Hannaford, and then the hall erupted. People stood, they clapped, some wiped their eyes, some looked up, as if thanking someone they couldn't see. The girl didn't bow. She just looked out at the audience and smiled softly, shyly, because she knew her father would have been proud. The applause faded, but the feeling didn't. She remained seated at the piano, hands resting on her lap, heart still beating like a drum inside her chest. The sound of the crowd clapping still echoed in her ears, but all she could really hear was him, her father, not his voice, not his footsteps, but his music. That one song had always been his favorite. It wasn't famous. It wasn't from a movie or a concert. It was something he had written himself, long ago when she was just a baby. He used to say, "One day when I'm not around, this song will remind you I never truly left." At the time, she didn't understand. Now, she did. As she stood and bowed politely, she caught sight of her mother in the back. Her hands clutched together, lips trembling. She wasn't clapping anymore. She was just staring like she had seen a ghost, or maybe like she had found something she thought was lost forever. The girl stepped off the stage, notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Her legs felt weak again. But for a different reason this time. Not fear, relief. A quiet voice stopped her near the side of the stage. "Excuse me," said an older man in a brown jacket. "That song, I've heard it before, your father used to play it at the end of every festival." She nodded gently, not trusting her voice. "He taught my son for 2 years," the man continued. "He was a good man. Kind, the way you played tonight." It felt like he was still here. She smiled. Her eyes filled again. "Thank you," she whispered. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Neighbors came up to her. Strangers shook her. Hand teachers hugged her. The mayor even offered her a spot in the town's music mentorship program. But all she wanted was to find her mother, and when she did, the older woman didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her close. No words, no explanations, just music between their hearts. Later that night, they sat side by side at home, the old piano just a few feet away. Her mother broke the silence. "I thought I'd never hear that song again," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't." "Want to forget it?" the girl replied. "You wouldn't have wanted that either." Her mother looked at her, really looked. "When did you start practicing again? At night when you were sleeping?" "I didn't tell anyone. I wanted it to be for him." Tears rolled down her mother's cheeks. But she didn't look sad. "You brought him back for a moment," she said, and the girl believed it. That night, the piano didn't stay silent. For the first time in months, her mother opened the lid and placed her fingers gently on the keys. She hadn't played in years. It's not even with him. But now, with her daughter beside her, she found the strength to press the first note. Together, they played the song again slowly, softly, a duet made not just of music, but of memory, of healing, of love. Outside, the moonlight spilled through the window. Down the street, a few windows were still lit as people shared the story of what had happened that evening. They didn't talk about talent. They didn't talk about awards. They talked about feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time. They talked about hope, and one woman on the porch whispered to her husband, "I think the town is finally beginning to heal." The song had ended, but the room didn't move, not even a breath. The final note still hung in the air like it didn't want to leave. It's like even the piano knew that something sacred had just passed through the hall. The crowd sat frozen, as if they were afraid that even blinking might break the spell. She had walked off the stage by then. Quietly, her notebook still pressed to her chest. She didn't wave, didn't bow again. She didn't have to. Her message had already been delivered through every key. She touched, and it had reached every heart in that room. In the front row, Mr. Haniff had tears running down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them. He just stared at the empty piano seat, lost in memories. "I heard that song every evening for years," he whispered to the person beside him. And tonight, it sounded exactly the same. Behind him, a teenager who usually spent his time glued to his phone had put it down during the performance and hadn't touched it since. Near the back, a mother gently rocked her baby, who had fallen asleep during the melody. "She played like someone twice her age," she murmured. And in the very last row was her mother, still staring, still silent. She didn't know how to stand. Her legs wouldn't move. Her hands were shaking in her lap. Not because of fear, but because the weight of all those memories of her husband, their music, their daughter, had finally come rushing back. And somehow, instead of hurting, it felt beautiful. Backstage. The girl found a quiet corner and sat down. She was exhausted. But it wasn't the kind of tired that made you want to sleep. It was the kind that came after you gave your heart away and didn't regret it. Someone tapped her shoulder. She looked up to see the event organizer, kind woman who had known her father well. "You made the entire town cry tonight," she said softly. "I think he would have been proud." The girl didn't know what to say, so she just smiled. Then the woman added, "No one left yet, you know." The girl blinked. What? The audience? They're still sitting there, waiting like they don't want to go home. She peeked out from behind the curtain, and it was true. The stage lights were still glowing. The fairy lights twinkled. The piano sat alone in the center, but no one was standing. They were just sitting there, still. A few people were whispering. Others had their eyes closed. Some were holding hands. Some were simply staring at the piano like it was a doorway to something they didn't want to close yet, in a way. It was that one song had done something no speech, no sermon, no announcement could have done it. Reminded everyone of the same thing, that music could bring people back together. That memories weren't always painful. That even when someone's gone, their love doesn't leave. The last note faded, and this time they let it go. No one clapped. No one stood. But the silence in the room said more than any applause ever. The mother and daughter sat still on the piano bench, their fingers resting gently on the keys. For a moment it felt like the past and present were sitting together, like the father was right there, listening, smiling, proud. Then slowly the mother turned to her daughter and whispered, "You brought him back." The girl didn't answer with words. She simply leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. She didn't need to say anything. The music had already spoken for her the next morning. The story spread like sunlight. At the bakery, people talked about it over warm bread and tea. At the market, vendors hummed the melody without realizing. At the school, teachers paused in hallways. Remembering the expression on the girl's face when she played, something had shifted in the town. It was small, quiet, but real. The girl hadn't just played a song. She had opened something that had been locked away in everyone, something soft and aching and buried at home. The piano lid stayed open. For months, it had been shut like a coffin. But now, the keys saw light every day. Sometimes the girl played after school. Sometimes her mother joined her. Sometimes they didn't even speak. They just sat and let the music fill the space between them. They didn't talk about the performance much. They didn't need to. It had done its job. They had honored him. And somehow, through the sound of their hands on the keys, he had come back not in body, but in spirit and love. One afternoon, a letter came in the mail. It was from the mayor's office. The envelope was plain. The message was simple. Your music touched the heart of this town. We'd like to offer you a place in the upcoming youth music program. You get to train, learn, and one day teach. The girl stared at the paper, unsure how to feel. She hadn't played to impress anyone. She hadn't played to become a performer. She had played to remember someone she lost. And yet, the music had taken her somewhere new, somewhere he would have wanted her to go. A week later, something unexpected happened. A small boy, maybe 7 years old, knocked on their front door. He clutched a toy piano in his arms, plastic. Missing one key, the mother opened the door and smiled. "Hello?" The boy looked up. "Is she home? The girl who plays the real piano?" The mother called for her daughter. When she appeared, the boy held out the toy keyboard. "Can you teach me? I want to play that song too." The girl knelt down, smiled softly and said, "Yes, I can." Soon, more children came. Some with parents, some alone, some shy. Some curious. They didn't come because she was famous. They came because they had felt something. They wanted to feel it again. So, every weekend she cleared the living room, wiped the piano clean, and let her father's legacy live on in the laughter and clumsy fingers of young hands learning for. The first time, the house, once filled with silence, now echoed, with sounds, some of it messy, some off-key, but all of it alive. Years passed, the girl grew older. Her hands became more confident, her smile more open. She never forgot that night. On stage, she never stopped playing that one song. She taught it to every student. It's not as a performance piece, but as a way to remember someone. She never once told them it. It was written by her father. She wanted them to discover its meaning on their own, and they did. One day, long after the piano had lost its shine, a young student asked her a question. "Why do you play this song so much?" She looked out the window, where the sky was turning gold with sunset. Then she turned to the child and said with a soft smile, "Because someone once played it for me, when I needed it most." And that was all she said, because some music isn't meant to be explained. Some music is meant to be felt. The end.